Hello, everyone, and welcome to our group presentation for HCI 589. Together, we will be discussing the subject of dehumanization resulting from the proliferation of computers. As this is a massively broad topic, we obviously cannot cover every subject area, but we will describe some of the more publicized topics. We have 4 sections that each of our team members will address.
Hi, I'm Keith Fellger, and I'll be talking about the historical perspective of this issue.
Hi, I'm Jason Ugie, and I will be talking about the pros and benefits of computers' effects on our society.
Hi, I'm Jessie Ashdown, and I will be talking about the cons and issues of computers' effects on our society.
Hi, I'm Quinne Fokes, and I'll be talking about the future aspects of where we are headed as a result of our love affair with computers.
So to provide a little background on what exactly dehumanization means, we looked at several different versions of the word. Originally, it was used in the early 1800s to refer to what was happening to slaves at the time. Once modern society began to realize that slaves were human, the treatment was therefore considered dehuman. We do want to focus more on the effect of the spirit or the person being taken out of the equation. There are a couple of other broad descriptions of dehumanization, such as animalistic, as well as mechanistic, as you can see here. So from a historical perspective, we've probably all heard people say that computers will take our jobs, mechanization will take our jobs, automation will take our jobs, and that is nothing new. That's been around since the beginning of computers, according to some people such as GCN from the Wall Street Journal. We're going to look at the time period starting in the early 70s. 1971 was when Intel invented the microprocessor. And from that point forward, the stark, obvious replacement of workers began to be evident. And back when ATMs, word processing software, voicemail, accounting, logistics software, and desktop publishing first arrived, the fear was that the workers were being replaced. Beeson, as we see here in Table 1, indicates that the proper vernacular is displacement. And the reason that term has been modified is that displacement means that workers will find new jobs, possibly in the same field, but those jobs are up-leveled, they're more technologically sound, they're less menial, and nonetheless, workers in this era were able to find up-leveled jobs. Some of the common things that you would hear now if you were to have a discussion about replacement of people with computers and mechanization, automation, would be in the medical field. Historically, the usage of computers up to 1990 was purely for office-related work. There was some experimental patient monitoring going on in that period. Post 1990 to today, of course, if you walk into any medical facility, you will be surrounded by HCI. It's huge, of course. And of course, as a result, the medical efficacy has greatly increased. Agriculture is another one. Quite a interesting statistic that in 1900, 41% of U.S. workers were in agriculture. Today, it's around 1.2%, 2% in 2000. Manufacturing, of course, we hear about that all the time, especially with robotics. In 1980, 1 in 5 U.S. jobs was in manufacturing. In 2011, 1 in 10. A couple of professors from MIT are very vociferous about the issues that we are facing that they attribute directly to the proliferation of computer technology. In this left slide here, note that about the year 2000, so I don't know if you can see the text here, but the subtitle is U.S. Productivity and Employment. So this is like a measure of economic output, the top line. The bottom line is numbers of the employed. Notice that the economy is still on an upward trend, yet at around the year 2000, a major divergence occurs and employment does not rise accordingly. This graph down here shows it a little more specifically with related to GDP and household income, where average household income is also on a divergence with average GDP. On the slide on the right here, notice that job growth back in the 40s was in near 40%. Through time, notice the 90s are almost 20%, but from 2000, the first decade, it's down 1%. Also on this graphic here, this indicates the distribution of skills of the workforce. Notice that in the non-skilled is very high. Medium skill is quite low, and then high skilled is much higher than the medium. The income of the middle is showing a very disturbing trend of dropping relative to the other skill levels. So in summary, until recently, displacement was the reality. The promise of better jobs was true. People were able to retool themselves, up-level their skills, and the ethical concerns were not that great. There was pain, of course, in segments, but for the most part, people were able to up-level their skills and find new jobs. The 2011 is also another point. You might have seen on those graphs there that the angle at which the divergence is occurring is accelerating. So there's some urgency in some camps on what are we going to do about this. The solution, and some believe there is a solution, is that we can, through further training and education, once again get ahead of that divergence. And a quote from Rotman from MIT that it's hard to ignore the warning that technology is widening the income gap between the tech savvy and everyone else. And now I will turn it over to Jason.
Thanks, Keith. I want to provide a quick background on the last three generations. Next slide. Thank you. So the three generations, it's unique that we have three generations in the workforce today. Moreover, baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials perceive the world differently, thus raising ethical questions on how each generation should behave and use technology. Currently, millennials are impacting our world with their ideals. And now let's review these generations. First, we have baby boomers. They're our first sort of rock and roll generation, counterculture. But in Strauss and Howe, in their theory, they talk about the baby boomers clashing of ideals in society. Generation X, they rebel against the baby boomers and are with that rebellion become individualistic. They're pragmatic, not very idealistic. You could call them jaded at times, but they are the first generation to be raised with mass media. Millennials are also finding their way. They are the first generation with full technology. So they are very technology driven. They are multitasking, extremely entrepreneurial, and unlike boomers, they are building to an ideal. We just don't know what that ideal is. Next slide. So as you can see, by 2020, millennials will make up more than 1 of 3 adults. And it's estimated that by 2025, they will make up as much as 75% of the workforce. Millennials now represent the largest generation in the United States, comprising roughly 1/3 of the total population in 2013. As you can see on in the graphic, around age 23, that's the most millennials that we have in the workforce or coming into the workforce at 4.3 million. Millennials will continue to have an impact on the population for years to come. Next slide. So technology. There have been significant changes to industries such as human medicine, health sciences, agriculture over the last several decades. But Gen Y has a different view. I mean, technology is really part of their culture. Millennials' vision of technology is about disrupting older business models or social behaviors. As an example, Mark Zuckerberg, age 30, right now, Facebook and social media. Evan Spiegel, 24, invented Snapchat, messaging and social media. Patrick Collison, Stripe payments. Stripe, if you're not familiar with Stripe, they have really revolutionized payments for small, medium, and large companies. Companies such as Kickstarter and Fitbit and some banks also use Stripe as their back-end processing. The power within Stripe is that it avoids really talking to the bank. So small businesses and people who are not in tune with how to set a payment system up can easily accomplish this and take payments that same day after getting installed. And Parker Conrad, 34, he created Zenefits. It's an HR and payroll system. Within the first 8 months of Zenefits, Zenefits was $1 million run rate revenue. And Business Insider reports that they're the fastest growing cloud company ever. Next slide. So as millennials enter the workforce and participate in life in general, there's jobs and there's values that that they have to deal with the other generations. So 29% of entrepreneurs are between the ages of 20 and 34, and 92% of surveyed 21 to 24-year-olds said entrepreneurship education was vital in the new economy. Millennials have a unique ability to find niches and to solve problems. Their unique, their use of technology, their understanding of technology, and how things are constructed and go together, they're able to find these niches where larger companies can't go. That is why we're seeing a lot of different startups coming out every single day with very interesting apps or very interesting services that these larger companies aren't filling. Millennials create communities built around shared interests, not geographical or proximity based. Such as Facebook or using Google Hangouts, they are more than willing to talk, make friends, communicate, do work across all sorts of geographical boundaries, unlike other generations who were more office bound. And third, almost 2/3 of the millennial employees say they want their employer to contribute to social and ethical causes. Only half of boomers and older Gen Xers survey felt the same way. So millennials definitely have ethical standards on the companies that they want to work for and that they work for. I think this says a lot about where their ideals could be taking the country. And lastly, part of these ideals, millennials want creativity. They feel it's important in their job role. And this graph from Intuit in 2014 shows that 83% feel that creativity is valued. Next slide. So this slide just further supports the entrepreneurial spirit. 47% want to work, millennials want to work at companies with less than 100 employees. Next slide. So interactions, millennials, as said earlier, interact all day long. They interact on their phones with their friends, but they also interact with all the different generations that are out there. But interesting, in 2012 Pew Research survey, 55% of the respondents agreed that in 2020, the brains of multitasking teens and young adults are wired differently from those over age 35, and overall it yields helpful results. They go on to say that they do not suffer notable cognitive shortcomings as they multitask and cycle quickly through personal and work-related tasks. Rather, they are learning more and they are more adept at finding answers to deep questions. I think this very much speaks to, we see millennials face down, but they're also multitasking. Their culture is very different from the Gen Xers or baby boomers. But this is the way, this is their ideal, this is their culture, and this is how they're proceeding within the environment and making these ethical decisions on how to use technology and how it works for them. 80% of millennials said they would prefer feedback in real time rather than traditional performance reviews. So we think that millennials are looking down all the time, which they do definitely use their devices, and there's a lot of research that supports that. But when you want traditional, when you want real feedback in real time, you are talking to somebody. You are interacting with people in real time. And 65% of millennials feel that personal development was the biggest influence in their job. So again, creativity plays a big role, as well as growing personally. Other generations want to grow professionally. Millennials feel that they want to grow personally. This is a big divergence, and definitely an ethical question. Millennials are more comfortable working in teams in past generations. Again, this is about interacting with real people. And finally, millennials are multi-channel artists. They are carving out a model of the world and using technology to their advantage. I will now turn it over to Jesse.
It doesn't help if you have the mute button on. Thank you so much, Jason. So what I wanted to focus on is looking at, okay, here's all these positives that Jason talked about, especially if you look at it from the millennial perspective. But there's definitely a few downsides. And I really wanted to focus on 3 specific areas. And we've all kind of touched on some of these. And Quinne will be touching on more of it in her section. But the first one is future jobs. So Keith had kind of mentioned this sort of history of this concern that technology was replacing mundane jobs, but now machines and computers are replacing higher skill level jobs. But what does this implication have going forward? So we talked about some examples like bank tellers, airline check-in, accountants, that sort of thing. But what does this mean if these higher skill level jobs are being displaced, as Keith pointed out, by this technology? And I wanted to kind of point out a converse side of that is that, you know, machines aren't really very good at menial labor jobs, such as janitorial work or things like that. So there's definitely more job availability in this area. So what we see is there creates this dichotomy. High skill, high tech, or high touch jobs rather, are still very much needed by humans, jobs like managers, doctors, things like that. But this sort of middle area where it's a higher skill level, but not maybe the highest skill level or highest touch job, it's these kind of middle skill level, middle class jobs that are sort of being displaced by this technology. And, you know, what implications does that have going forward? We could surmise that this creates a greater divide, a greater dichotomy in society between sort of menial jobs and these extremely high skill level jobs, effectively potentially eradicating this middle class. So this is one area that is definitely of concern in dehumanization, the technology growing, especially in future jobs. But let's look at social interacting. So next slide. So with this, and Jason really hit on this with social interactions, especially with millennials. So for example, a survey by Intel Labs in 2013 of 12,000 millennials showed that 61% of them felt that technology was dehumanizing them. And the greatest area of concern was technology's effect on their socialization. And if we really kind of piece this apart, we can see that, you know, technology-based social interactions are really passive at best. When you are interacting with somebody just via a chat or Facebook or something like that, there are many things that are missed. They're not very personal. There are nuances in behavior that are missed, such as tone of voice, body language, things like that, which certainly we can see with the advent of things like Skype or even Zoom are trying to, you know, temper that somewhat, right? To kind of give some of that human face-to-face interaction back to people. But when you also have this sort of depersonalization of this social interaction, you also find that people have the courage to say things or do things that maybe they wouldn't normally otherwise. And, you know, this can have implications on the way people interact, period. If somebody has more courage to say, you know, more nasty things to another person, you get cyberbullying, which is something that we see a large proliferation of in society today. Another thing that, in particular, millennials have been concerned about is technology allowing for people to misrepresent themselves. So, you know, when things are very depersonalized or very virtual in nature of these interactions, you see implications in the job world. You know, for example, how does a hiring manager know who they're really hiring? It's just text on a piece of paper and potentially a phone call. There's this disconnect of really knowing who that person is and how they would be in person. We also see this in personal interacting, you know, things like online dating. There have been many instances of people not knowing who they're really talking to, and it could potentially be dangerous. So certainly we can see that, you know, the way that these social interactions have changed with the advent of technology certainly has some worrying areas. But to me, the area that is potentially the most concerning is that of technology's impact on culture. Next slide, please. So when we think about technology and culture, we really can't ignore population. And Jason pointed that out very much of, we see this, really exponential growth in population. And really, we can't deny that affects our culture. As Keith pointed out, we have medical advances in technology, and that has allowed our population to burgeon from 2.5 million, for example, in 1950 to now being over 7.2 billion. So when you have that enormous amount of people, you have that many more people interacting, that many more people needing jobs, that many more people needing resources. And this affects society, it affects culture, it affects the entire world, right? So then you have to take a step back and say, okay, but what is that effect of an increased population on society? If we have more people that need more resources, do you have different kinds of interaction between people? Does it make people want to be more aggressive, more assertive, because they are fighting for resources that are so limited? And the more the population grows, the more limited these resources are going to be. Or even if we look back at that case of passive social interaction, if there are more people that need to do more interacting and more of it's passive, it sort of begs the question of what would we see in 100 years? How would people be interacting if the way that they learn how to socialize is all technologically based and virtual? We also see other areas of this in something such as like losing your personal connectedness with the environment. The more buildings, the more concrete, things like that, we have less connection to nature. And there's concern that being less connected to your environment could affect you. I don't think anyone really knows how it might affect people, but certainly we know that people love houses with a view, right? We care about what it is that we see in nature around us, and the less of that there is, it certainly could affect the things that are important to people. And what's important to people really drives the way that a culture functions, the way that a culture interacts with itself and interacts with other cultures around the world. And, lastly, we can kind of look at, does the proliferation of technology, does it mean that we would become less productive or more lazy as technology is doing more for us? An example I love to, pull out is that of a calculator, right? And if we were to go fast forward to 100 years from now, would society not know how to do simple addition and subtraction because there's a calculator that does it for you? Now that might seem something that, well, who cares? So you know how to push a button on a calculator, but maybe that has more of an impact on culture and the way that we teach and the way that we learn, things like that so much of this has become mechanized. But now I feel like I'm getting into the future, right? So let's pass it off to Quinne, and she can speak about the future of all this.
I'm sorry, my computer screen I just lost my internet connection. Okay. So if we're where Han Solo was with his kind of clunky machine and fighting with technology, down the road with a better integration of HCI and more people engaged with computers globally, we could function like Captain Kirk on the Enterprise. Next slide. In our work lives, there is a high degree of stress around HCI. People can be dehumanized by their inability to disconnect from work. However, there are signs of hope for the future. Trends towards a work-life balance, coupled with millennials coming on board with having a different attitude than the previous generation had towards work. For example, millennials dislike hierarchy. If the hierarchies the millennials dislike do break down and evolve into more egalitarian workplaces, HCI, by facilitating transparency, trust, improving connections, and thereby indirectly helping to decrease corporate greed and increase social responsibility, could help to humanize instead of dehumanize us. And just one example from the field, HCI allows us to better accommodate work location preferences of introverts and extroverts, for example. Next slide. In just one example of the animalistic dehumanizing effect of social media, a missing student was rumored to be a terrorist and a bombing suspect in the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombings. This false information was broadcast by one blogger to 6 million people, with devastating effects on the family, and the student himself was found dead in a river. However, on the plus side, changes are in the works, and I think we can be cautiously optimistic about improvements as ethics evolve around social media. Next slide. Given memory isn't a human strong suit, and that we use our problem-solving skills to get around our shortage of memory, then apps could just be a future extension of the pencil, and not so dehumanizing after all. In the future, improved apps and better integration of their use globally could mean more time to do the things humans do better than memorize lists. Next slide. Yes, some have come to resemble the passive blobs in the movie Wall-E. Recently, however, there's been an interest in making our work lives more active. As for the pilots, we hope their planes will be re-engineered using better interfaces that mimic the feel of flying and possibly gamified to make flying more fun. As we have come to learn, the millennials love games. While we're currently a bit like Han Solo and his clunky ship, the future holds promise with millennials' emphasis on relationship, sharing, interdependence, responsibility, and caring, which entails engaging and listening. And the listening is key to improving user experience for human-computer interactions in the future. Listening to what people really want and creating technologies that adapt to a wide variety of personal experiences is the future of technology. One can hope. Thank you for listening to our presentation today, and we're going to leave you with a few questions. So let's scoot to the next slides and pull up those questions. In 100 years, will computers be running people or people running computers? With what we know right now, are millennials' ethics on board with building a more ethical society in the future? Will the economy of the future support a society where 47% are non-traditional workers? Do you think the possible dehumanization of people by technology is a positive thing or a negative thing? And finally, are millennials likely to maintain the same ethical considerations, care ethics, as they age? And how well will they influence the next generation's human-computer interactions? Thank you very much.